Greetings to all the viewers from across the world. Welcome to this exclusive session by Tillotoma Foundation, where we are privileged to have Dr. Gordon M. Hahn. I am Soham Das, Director of the Tillotoma Foundation, and it's a pleasure for us to host this conversation with such an erudite and globally renowned expert of security strategy and international politics as Dr. Hahn. Dr. Hahn's books include Ukraine Over the Edge, Russia, the West, and the New Cold War, which released in 2018, the Caucasus Emirate, Mujahideen, Global Jihadism in Russia's North Caucasus and Beyond in 2014, Russia's Islamic Threat in 2007, Russia's Revolution from Above, Reform, Transition, and Revolution in the Fall of the Soviet Communist Regime, 1985 to 2000. This is in 2002, and several others. He's an expert in Russian studies, Eurasian politics, global terrorism, and US-Russian relationship. He has taught at Stanford, St. Petersburg State University, Boston, American University, St. Joe State, and San Francisco State Universities, and has been a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and the George F. Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies. A welcome to you, Dr. Hahn.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
I'm prepared to do some introductory remarks that I prepared.
Dr. Hahn, if you could just speak a bit louder. I think your audio is coming up.
Okay, I'll move the computer a little bit closer. Hello, how about now? Is it better?
It's better.
Better? Okay. In discussing Russian-American relations, and not just Russian-Western relations and Russian domestic politics, I think the most important thing to understand is that for over 300 years, the West has been Russia's constitutive other. That is, that Russia has its aspirations, its fears, its goals have been tied to the West. In terms of fears, that means that in terms of fears and trepidations, that means as a result of the way relations develop, that it's developed something of a security culture that's heavily focused on the West. And that is, in any political culture or any culture in general, security is an important aspect, but in Russia it's particularly important because of the relationship with the West. And so there have been three different ways in which Russia has either experienced threats or actual intervention, invasions, negative influence from the West. First is cultural influence, sometimes wanted, sometimes not. When Russia is in an aspirational, a period of aspiring to the West, it wants that cultural influence. When that cultural influence begins to either provoke a reaction in parts of Russia, it takes on a negative characteristic. The other two ways are Western intervention into Western political intervention, that is support for different factions in a political struggle, or outright military intervention or invasion. And so Russia is very sensitive, and I could go through the whole history of that, and maybe we can do that later if someone is interested in questions, but we don't really want to get too bogged down in history. The upshot of Russia's security culture is that when the Soviet Union collapsed and we had an independent post-Soviet Russia, the West made a miscalculation in looking at what had happened as a full-throated cry to become a democratic Western style state. That is, there were elements inside Russia that were still very opposed to that, and they were rooted in this traditional sort of security culture approach. The other problem was that because the nature of the regime transformation was a revolution from above, and by that I mean, in other words, it was not a revolution that was led from the streets, it was not a negotiated transition, and it was not an imposed transition by the regime. Rather, it was a revolution with one faction of party apparatchiks seizing power from another group of apparatchiks, and here I'm talking about Boris Yeltsin's Russian Federation leadership seizing power illegally before and then after the August coup, completing that seizure of power. the August 1991 coup. So that meant that there was, when the new regime began to be established, Yeltsin incorporated a lot of the old apparatchiks into the Russian bureaucracy. The security organs were not reformed, and they were the carriers of this sort of traditionalist anti-Western approach that still existed in the Soviet era and that was inherited from the Tsarist era. So this meant that when the West decided to expand NATO, they basically reactivated much more powerfully in areas outside the security departments, outside the military, outside the FSB, former KGB, in society. And certain political forces were able to use the threat of NATO expansion, which objectively speaking is a potential threat. So it wasn't hard for them to argue that the West again was causing problems. And so we had a revival of this whole security culture. And we see this even in the Yeltsin era, before Putin came to power. This was beginning to happen. The sort of the apex in the turn away, the beginning of the turn away from the West was the or the zenith was the events in Serbia in 1999, and that was right on the eve of Putin's arrival to power. So that was another problem. So we see in the course of Putin's period in power, Russia's attempt to create alternative international structures to NATO as a way to protect itself from NATO and as a way to find new allies, economic and military allies. The other part of this is the domestic aspect. This means that Russia turned back to a more authoritarian structure. It began to reject democracy. There were other reasons too. The failure of the West to help out Russia seriously economically during the early post-Soviet depression and so forth. But generally speaking, I think the main cause again was this, when relations are good with the West, Russia tends to be more open and tends to move towards reform. We saw this during the Perestroika period. And when things are bad, it begins to close down. It becomes to be more afraid of internal enemies who they suspect may be, per the security culture, may be in cahoots with foreign enemies, right? And so they want to the regime will begin to seek to protect itself from internal enemies, and that means reverting back to more authoritarian methods. So we begin to see, and then the problem accelerates, right? You have the beginning of NATO expansion in 97, then NATO expansion continues. It moves right up to Russia's borders with the incorporation of the Baltic states in 2007. Then you have Putin's warning at the Munich Security Summit that Russia had done all these things and hadn't gotten nothing but in return but NATO expansion. And then you have the events in Georgia, right? Which basically was a signal that the Russian-American so-called reset was basically doomed to failure. Why was it doomed to failure? Because it only addressed peripheral issues in the relationship between Washington and Moscow particularly, but also Russia and the West. It didn't deal with the issue of NATO expansion. It didn't deal with EU expansion, which was used as sort of a Trojan horse to facilitate NATO expansion. It didn't deal with the problem of color revolutions in countries that were allied with Russia or close to Russia. It didn't deal with any of those issues. It dealt with peripheral issues like arms control, although arms control can be important, especially when relationships are bad. But at the time, that was not a central issue. I'll talk a little bit about all that a little bit later. And so we see gradually Russia beginning to resist Western encroachment, right? We see this in Georgia, 2008. Not much of a reaction to 2005 in Ukraine. But then in 2013, with the Maidan revolt and the snipers massacre, which was clearly something that was not provoked by the so-called pro-Russian Ukrainian regime of Viktor Yanukovych. In fact, it was neo-fascist snipers who were among the demonstrators on the Maidan. And now for 5 years on, the West has been lying about what actually happened on the Maidan. And this also aggravates Russian suspicions and and creates problems. And then you see Russia moving beyond its the post-Soviet space, its near neighborhood, its near abroad, and beginning to react to Western encroachment in places like Syria and now even in Libya. And all this is basically sort of and most important result of this has been, right, the new alliance with China. It's not an alliance per se, it's a strategic partnership, that's what they call it. Militarily, it's it's very, very close to an alliance. This is sort of a fulfillment of the Brzezinski, what I call the Brzezinski prophecy, and that is that President Jimmy Carter's National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski said that after the end of the Cold War, that the main task for the United States and in the post-Soviet period was to prevent an alliance between Russia and China, that this would be fatal for Western interests. At the same time, unfortunately, Brzezinski also recommended the expansion of NATO. Towards the end of his life, he acknowledged that expanding NATO was a mistake. So NATO expansion actually led to this strategic alliance between Russia and China, and that's what I call this the Brzezinski prophecy. Basically, he got it half right, because his support of NATO expansion was clearly a mistake. Looking briefly at some issues related to terrorism that you wanted me to touch on, I think one way to look at that, if we talk about in recent times, is to look at the intervention in Syria. Clearly, the intervention in Syria was motivated by three factors. First, it was to, I'm not putting these in the order of importance necessarily. One was to protect an ally, someone who bought weapons, someone who helped ensure Russia's influence in the Levant, which it's had historically for centuries, going back to the Tsarist period and the Orthodox Church's presence in the Holy Land. But probably most importantly was the fact that when things started to fall apart in Iraq, and then the West, basically the United States, Obama and Hillary Clinton, President Obama and Hillary Clinton, essentially began to send arms to the Syrian rebels, ignoring warnings from the CIA itself that that doing this would mean the weapons would fall into the hands of jihadists. Nevertheless, they proceeded, and Russia had a serious problem on its hands because at the same time, jihadis from the North Caucasus, from the then more powerful Caucasus Emirate jihadi organization, and now there's an offshoot as well of the Islamic State in the North Caucasus, fled to Syria and Iraq in many hundreds, if not thousands. And that's what led to the decline in terrorism in Russia. The problem was that these jihadists from North Caucasus, not only from the North Caucasus, some from Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, and then also from neighboring countries in Central Asia, were going to Syria, and they would be able to network with jihadists in the area and potentially at some point return to Russia with increased combat skills, increased terrorist skills, greater contacts with other foreign terrorist groups, which means potential for assistance in carrying out attacks in Russia and developing a network more expansively in Russia than simply in the North Caucasus, and then occasionally cells emerged in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. So this was probably the real reason why, one of the main reasons certainly, and maybe the main reason why Putin decided to intervene in Syria. And in fact, a lot of the Russian fighting has been around the area where the jihadists from Russia were known to be concentrated in Idlib and these parts of Syria. So recently we've seen a decline in jihadism in Russia because we've seen, basically the squeezing of the balloon, and the jihadists went to Syria and Iraq. In general, in terms of global jihadism, I think the damage done to ISIS and other jihadi groups in Syria and Iraq has reduced the threat both to Russia and globally. But the global jihadists are losing, but they're not defeated by any stretch of the imagination. Talking about the present situation, the crisis situation in Russia. Basically, we're dealing with three different crises. One may have been already at least begin to have been removed. And we're talking about the simultaneous crisis of COVID-19, the rise in oil prices, and the resulting economic crisis that's ensuing. Russia has been, because I think one reason why Russia has suffered numerically less from the United States, although that's becoming a doubtful proposition in terms of portion of the population at present, Russia's beginning to catch up. But one reason I think is because simply you have less Russians tied into the international community, with the caveat that many Russians traveled to China where this began. But there's not a lot of evidence that the virus spread in Russia in most part because Russians were returning from China or Wuhan or something. There's just simply not evidence for that. Russians do travel a lot in Europe. Of course, Americans also travel in Europe, and there's a lot of business and a lot of contact with Europeans, so that's also a factor. And Americans also do a lot of business in China. So it's hard to tell, but I would say one reason why the Russian numbers are somewhat lower is because it's somewhat less tied into the global economy. This is creating economic. Now, the other issue was the simultaneous collapse of the OPEC Plus agreement, which led to a collapse in oil prices. At this very same time, COVID begins, so it's sort of almost a perfect storm. And this is leading to a potentially severe economic crisis in Russia. Estimates are that the GDP in Russia will fall this year from anywhere from 10 to somewhere from between 10 and 12%. Unemployment in 2020 is going to reach at least 10%, if not higher. Some estimates claim that within a year or two, it's possible that half the Russian population will be unemployed. That seems to be a bit of a stretch from my point of view, especially since now we're beginning to see the beginning of the rolling back of the quarantine related to Russia, in Moscow, for example. And Moscow is the epicenter of COVID-19 in Russia. So if they get it under control in Moscow, they'll get it under control everywhere eventually. They're expecting a salary decline of 9%. So that means even those who don't go into unemployment are going to take a serious economic and financial hit. And this, of course, increases the potential for political discontent amongst the population. It's also important to note that about 1/3 of the economic decline was related to the oil price decline, not COVID-19. It's estimated approximately. So you have these three crises. The one that will last the longest will probably be the economic crisis, and that probably is the one that has the most serious political implications. And this, of course, comes at the same time that Putin was planning this plebiscite on constitutional changes, which has been increasingly. It's hard to tell, but it looks like it's either a elaborate deception operation or a consequence of great indecision. Because initially he said that he was talking about a government that would be formed by the parliament, and these began to look like liberal reforms when he first announced it. However, this had quickly disappeared from the proposed amendments, and instead there were amendments about making statements about the existence of God, which plays to the Orthodox Church, which tends to be politically conservative, ideas about the Russian ethnic group as sort of the core nationality of Russia, which can create a potential backlash among non-ethnic Russian nationalities. And then of course the most important change, right, is to change the nullification, what's called the nullification of the previous terms that Putin has served, allowing him to run for another term, and in fact 2 other terms. So gradually, what you had was a reform that looked like constitutional reform that looked like it would be more liberal, and is in fact becoming increasingly more traditionalist and authoritarian, with the prospect of Putin remaining in power for another 12 years after 2024, if he wins the election, which would probably not be in doubt. When you look at the deceptive nature of or at least the deceptive appearance of this operation, now it is possible. I mentioned that it was also possibly indecision. It could be. I don't reject the possibility that the onset of the coronavirus crisis and the oil crisis prompted Putin to change direction, because he did make what looked like a fairly hasty decision to come to the Duma and announce the possibility of the nullification. So maybe it was designed to look like it was spontaneous, but in fact wasn't. Who knows? Hard to tell. But the fact is that you look at this sort of operation that would look to many to be somewhat deceptive inside Russia and outside Russia. The economic crisis, the potential problem if the regime is seen not to have dealt well with the COVID-19 crisis, the potential that the OPEC crisis could then reemerge. So an oil price decline. So you could be seeing, again, these multiple crises linger, and we're already seeing that there's a gradual decline in Putin's popularity and trust ratings. Not severe at this point, but a gradual decline. And there also is some evidence of marginal regime splitting, and of course that's a key factor in any regime transformation, either revolutionary or transitional. If the regime begins to split, then you could have soft-liners who defect to the opposition, and maybe they would force Putin to negotiate a transition, or maybe they would be able to mount a revolution. The evidence of this regime splitting is that the Communist Party, which usually plays ball with the Kremlin, has told its members that they can vote according to their conscience when it comes to the plebiscite on constitutional amendments on July 1st. And the Communist Party recently harshly condemning the detention of a leader of a socialist party with ties to the Communist Party. And again, the Communist Party usually plays ball with the Kremlin, doesn't take steps like this. So this is a sign that maybe they're beginning to smell that the regime is weakening, or could weaken in the future, and they're hedging their bets. And if others begin to do this, particularly regime liberals inside the regime, that could be a major problem, especially if the communists wanted to make an alliance on the streets with liberals. Turning to looking at what the implications are for Russia's place in the world, Russia's potential crises or stabilization, and especially its relationship with China and the fulfillment of the Brzezinski prophecy. If we look at the present situation, and this is also will be a prism through which we can look at U.S.-Russian, Sino-Russian, and U.S.-Chinese relations more closely, is essentially there are several scenarios I believe that we can talk about on the international stage as a result of the United States gradually declining relative to China, and China's so-called soft rise, and having a powerful ally like Russia. So there are several possibilities for the international system. One is sort of a new bipolarity or a new bipolar stability, featuring an autocratic or authoritarian bloc led by China and perhaps and Russia, against a Western democratic bloc that would also perhaps include, of course, Japan, and maybe at some point India would choose to join the West against the authoritarian bloc, but that's not clear. Another possibility is, these all come under the heading of a sort of restructuring of the political system into bipolarity and multipolarity, or multipolarity. The second is a turn to tripolarity, in which the US and the EU and China become the main poles. That is, France, France has been making noise about trying to create the EU as a sort of more separate entity, and tensions from the US and tensions between Germany and the US and with Trump throughout Europe might be helping to facilitate this. One problem is one persistent problem would be the continued presence of the military structure, NATO. One sign that we'd be moving towards a trilateral structure and separation of the Atlantic, a division of the Atlantic community between the United States and Europe would be if the Europeans got serious about creating some kind of a military, an army, a European army. But really, to pull this off, probably Europe would need Moscow as an ally, and Moscow appears now to be lost to the West. One way would be to bring in somehow China or India by Europe, but that seems to be a bit out of the cards. The other third tripolar scenario would be China as one pole, a second pole being Western and Central Eurasia, in which Russia and Europe would be allied in a single pole, and the United States. Now, this seems to be fairly unlikely. One question would be, would India join such a bloc, and where would India fit into such a scenario? Again, where would China fit? Japan fit into such a scenario? India may be driven by Chinese hubris into joining one of those poles. B and C are clearly the less stable ones because they're multipolar. So you have potential games between two of the three poles. For example, as happened on the eve of World War II, where you had basically the communist world, democratic world, and the fascist world. And the inability of the communist and the liberal world to come to an agreement against the fascist world led to Hitler's early successes, right? His great gambits, and then his early successes. A second scenario is a complete meltdown. That is a catastrophic scenario in which based on three possible coterminous simultaneous developments. The structure in the international system, the rise of China and the fall of the United States creates intense conflict between China. At the same time, we have an arms control collapse, with the United States having withdrawn from ABM, Russia having withdrawn from a CFE, the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement in 2015, largely in large part due to NATO expansion. Now we see Trump's withdrawal from the Open Skies, and the New START agreement, which controls strategic nuclear weapons, is due to expire next year. So we have a complete collapse of the arms control agreement. So you have two things. You have a shifting structure, which promotes conflict. You have a collapse of the arms control in Western Eurasia, in Europe. And then you have the rising socio-political instability being created by the new cyber world, in which which creates great uncertainty. Lots of fake news, fake reporting. The leaderships, the elites of different countries are beginning to use this as a weapon, which creates greater uncertainty and polarizes both their own societies and relations between countries. The prospect that in the future you're going to have videos and audios that are indistinct. You cannot, fake audios, I should say, and fake videos that you cannot determine are fake. This will create great uncertainty and polarize matters even more. And on the background of the international structure changing and a lack of arms control agreements, this seems to me to be extremely dangerous, and the catastrophic scenario almost daily seems to me to be becoming more possible. So this is a problem. Maybe I should stop there and we turn to questions, because I've already gone for what, half an hour? I lost the sound for some reason. I lost the sound. I can't hear.
Hello. Thank you.
Okay, now I can. Now I can hear.
Thank you, Dr. Hahn, for your very insightful initial comments, and you must have covered all the areas that we are scheduled to discuss. So we will just get into the more details and specific. First of all, I would like to ask you about President Putin. You know, President Putin has a KGB background, so he has a Cold War background. So from there, today's Russia, do you think he has been able to take Russia to some extent towards its lost glory as a global superpower, USSR?
No, and I don't think that's even possible. And I actually don't even think that's. I don't think he envisages Russia becoming again the second pole in a bipolar world. I think he understands that Russia, for various reasons, because of population, because of various military vulnerabilities, because of economic backwardness, that Russia, at least for foreseeable many decades, could not mount a challenge to either the United States or China. And I think that's one reason, in lieu of being integrated into the West, it sought out a partnership with China. And I think Putin is very much a realist. And even if you look at the nature of the authoritarian regime that he runs domestically, I didn't get into this too much. I was planning to, but somehow I skipped over it. Is that it's a soft authoritarian regime that uses very surgical repression. And I think he does the same thing on the international stage. Where there are opportunities, he takes opportunities, but he also tries not to be aggressive. I think most of what looks like aggression to the West and others in the international community is actually a response to perceived threats. You know, if you look at, for example, what happened in Ukraine. Remember, this came after several decades of Russia complaining about NATO expansion, of EU expansion becoming a Trojan horse of NATO expansion. Because if you look at the record, if you look at all the countries who became EU members and NATO members, on average, 8 years after a country signs an association agreement to become a member of the EU, it joins NATO. So Ukraine was about to sign an association agreement with the European Union. It was therefore not going to be part of Russia's own Eurasian economic community, and Ukraine was the most important prospective member, besides Russia itself, which is a member, for Russia to build sort of an economic community inside the former Soviet Union. And then you add on top of it the large amounts of assistance to opposition groups from the West. And then you add in what happened on Maidan with snipers actually from the demonstrators shooting both police and demonstrators, and that leading to the overthrow of Yanukovych. The reason why Putin then went in to take Crimea, and there were elements in the West who tried to portray this as some kind of plan, that this is a plan all along to take Crimea. And of course, this is utter nonsense. This is a way to recoup lost face, because if Putin lost Ukraine to the West, you would have the potential of a NATO naval base in Sevastopol, where the Russians keep their Black Sea naval fleet. You would have potential of NATO troops on Russia's border. You would have potential of a pro-NATO, pro-Western state ruling over many ethnic Russians in East Ukraine. And most of those, and in Crimea, certainly 70–80% of the population did not want to be in Ukraine. They would prefer to be in Russia. And all opinion polls have shown that since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the Donbass, where the civil war then emerged, the same thing. So Putin simply very stealthily, right? You look at the way he did it, very surgically done. Basically deployed a few hundred soldiers around Ukraine, organized a referendum. No one was killed. I think one person was killed in the whole operation in Crimea. And no one knows who fired the shot. Someone was shot, I believe, inside their apartment. No one knows who fired that. In other words, the Russians used no force. They used no force in this operation. And this is precisely how Putin operates. So he's very cautious, and he's even if you look at the quote that they often cite to prove that somehow Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union, where he talks about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century. What he means, if you read the entire quote and you read what he says after that, is he's talking about the fact that there were 25 million Russians left out of their homeland. People and territories that always had been part of Russia were now outside of Russia. You had families separated. This is what he was talking about. He wasn't talking about, now we're not going to be a co-superpower with the United States and be able to spread our vision of the world. That's gone from, the Russians now are very realist to be, and they understand their limits.
Right. So also understanding that, the reason that America has almost lost its unipolar moment, as you have been talking about realism, and realist scholar Professor John Mearsheimer has been talking that, the liberal delusion is broken and America's liberal hegemony is not working anymore. And his argument is that even President Trump, he in fact fought against the liberal ideas. So do you think that the next world order that you're talking about, whether it's a unipolar or a bipolar, will be where a world order where realism would be more prevalent again?
Well, that depends on how things unfold. Because what you're seeing, I'm not an expert on China, so I don't notice this, but maybe some China experts have. But certainly in Russia, you're beginning to see, over maybe the last 5–10 years, a creeping ideologization of Russian politics, though it's by far nothing that overshadows what I just said in response to your previous question, though it potentially could. And that is the rise of this whole Eurasian Eurasianist ideology. For Putin, the Eurasianist ideology is entirely economic and cultural. In other words, he doesn't see the necessity and certainly the possibility of creating a Eurasian a Eurasian political structure. He sees it as a way of reintegrating the economies of Eurasia as a way of bolstering the Russian economy and bolstering, therefore, Russian political power and international status. So you do see a beginning to see, but certainly at some point, hopefully, as an American, I would hope that you would see Americans begin to understand that, okay, yes, we may want to, and maybe we're right, that we would that it's better if the rest of the world had a liberal system, liberal economic system and political system. The question is, how do you facilitate its expansion? From my point of view, using force, destabilizing other countries' regimes, which is dangerous, because once revolutionary processes begin, you don't know how they're going to end. And generally speaking, if it turns violent, usually the people who come to power are not Democrats. Democrats tend to use force less, with the exception that we've tended to begin using force or stealth coercion increasingly over the last few decades, beginning with the Cold War, in response to the Soviets doing the same thing. So there's this problem, and there's also the hopefully at some point Americans will begin to turn towards a more isolationist policy. Well, not a fully isolationist policy, but something more isolationist, in which we try to return to our own liberal roots and use our system of democracy as an example. We don't need to be sending agents abroad to convince people anymore of democracy. If a particular country or opposition in a particular country wants to create a democratic system, they can go on the internet and find out how to do it. We don't need to be encouraging it, giving advice. If a government wants us to come in and give advice to encourage, then by all means, we should do that. But if the government is authoritarian, they don't want that, or they're afraid of instability, whatever the reason, I believe we shouldn't do that. We should set an example. We can speak about the advantages of having a democratic system and having an economic system that is market-oriented for the most part. And I think over time, if we're patient, most of the world will come to that. But if we try to do this by trickery or by lies, it leads to a backlash, as we're seeing.
Talking about the use of force, you were talking about the use of force. One recent situation has been in Syria for the last decade. And in Syria, there have been significant use of force from all the concerned parties. There has been a huge humanitarian refugee crisis. So how do you look at the Syrian crisis, firstly, as this catastrophe? How do you look at this humanitarian crisis also as a political turmoil? And secondly, from a geostrategic point of view, whom do you think is the ultimate gainer, whether it is Putin's Russia or United States?
Well, at this point, I believe first of all, I think we should briefly review what happened. Peaceful demonstrations did begin, although there was a threat of violence early on, and we immediately supported, in our typical sort of color revolution fashion, the opposition. But there is some evidence that initially also weapons began to go to the opposition. And the problem was that there was a lack of realism. In part, it may have had something to do with Obama's sympathy for Islam, which for me is perfectly fine. But the problem is which Islam? And I think he made a bet on the Muslim Brotherhood. His idea, I think, was that, of course, we don't want jihadists to come to power, but we also would like to see a non-Western, anti-colonial sort of Islam come to power in certain parts of the world. And so we see his support, for example, of the revolution in Egypt, and so several other things. And so they began to send aid from when Libya destabilized. They did the same thing in Libya. They tried to support the Muslim Brotherhood. The problem was that Al Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood overlapped very much. in Libya. And so when they began to send weapons over to the Syrian rebels, those weapons began also to go to Al-Qaeda groups like Nusra. I always forgot how it's what the title, but the main jihadi Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria. And then, of course, those weapons began to leak over into the Islamic State, which straddled Iraq and Syria. So there was a mix of causes here, where there was this mix of the American sort of revolutionism, Obama's own particular ideology, the American passion now, post-Cold War passion for maximizing American power and influence everywhere. And in reaction, of course, the Russians had to respond, because the Russians, again, they had many jihadists from Russia and from neighboring Central Asia, and also some from Azerbaijan, by the way, and even some who actually grew up in Georgia. In fact, one of the leading, the number 2 or number 3 man in the Islamic State was a former U.S. trained Georgian Kist. A Kist is basically a Georgian Chechen. And he was one of the leaders of the Islamic State there. And so Russia essentially, and also needed to protect its ally Assad. And so Russia naturally saw an opportunity when they saw that the United States was looking the other way, when oil was being sold from the Islamic State going to Turkey, and the United States wasn't doing anything, that the United States was talking about a war against jihadism, which they call the war against terrorism, but in fact was helping terrorists, whether accidentally or purposely, hard to tell. Putin saw an opportunity to expose what the United States was doing, right? And in most of the world, most people are not going to accept a Western power supporting jihadists, whether it's accidentally or purposefully. So that was basically another motive why Putin decided to intervene. I didn't mention that originally, but that was one of the reasons as well, was to expose really the fecklessness of Obama's policy. At this point, it's hard to tell who's going to win out, because the problem hasn't been completely solved. There is some division between Iran and Russia over how to deal in Syria. The Syrians aren't particularly overjoyed with the Iranian presence. And there's been some tension between Russia and Syria in recent months. So it's not clear how this is going to work out. And then, of course, you have the problem with Turkey, that Turkey is an independent player and has already proven to be an independent player. So it's a very touchy situation. And I think it's almost impossible to tell who will be the winner, because at some point the United States may decide again to intervene, for example. And of course, when you look at the One Belt, One Road China policy, China at some point is also going to find that it has an interest in the region. So we'll have to see. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah. Thank you. Also, if you look at the situation in Syria presently, there are a huge number of prisoners there. Prisoners from the Islamic State, etc. And the local administration, which has been set up, they don't have the infrastructure to try these people. And the United States is not there; they have exited. So, do you think? And this is a general question, not in specific. Since the Iraq War and since then, the United States have got into sticky situations in the Middle East and found it difficult to come out. And when it has come out, it has created even bigger problems.
Right. Yeah, we could see a repeat of basically what happened in Afghanistan, and even in Iraq, things are not consolidated. And given the sort of tribal and clannish nature of much of the politics in countries like this, it certainly can't be excluded that a lot of the Islamic State prisoners at some point will just be allowed to go free. That one of the main reasons why they were imprisoned in the first place was because the Americans were there and they were working with the regimes were working with the Americans, so they captured these people and imprisoned them. Once the United States begins to have less influence, certainly in Iraq, with Iran promoting its influence, and even Russia probably will have greater influence, and even China, it's very possible these, due to the domestic tribal nature of relations and the international factors, they'll just decide to release some of these ISIS characters who, some of them are from abroad, may return home to places like Russia and the United States and maybe India. And so, yeah, it's a real problem. Again, it shows the problem of, I think, I forget now who said it. Might have been Colin Powell, but he said, if you break it, you own it. And the problem is actually we don't. We break it, and then we don't own it, and we leave, and then it's left to the regional, the country where the events occurred, and then the regional other regional powers to deal with the issue. And I think this also discredits the whole idea of American leadership in the world and the promotion of democracy.
Right. Thank you. Do you think that, and this is almost a contemplative question, if you look at how, Nixon, in 1970s, he visited China and created, connected China into becoming these, opening up its economy, etc. And even now, throughout the 21st century, the 2 decades, US has been trying to reach out to China, with economic liberalization policies, etc. Why did the United States not, and if they attempted, why did it not work out with Russia when Russia became Russian Federation?
One of the main reasons was certainly NATO expansion, which I talked about earlier, and the Russian reaction due to its the importance of security, what I call the security culture, and its vigilance value of being vigilant against domestic, internal, and foreign threats. And so NATO expansion simply reactivated that culture and value. The other problem was very late. The other problem was Russia's revolution from above, which meant that the regime was only half reformed when it was born. Another factor was late and virtually non-existent economic assistance when the country was in its post-Soviet depression. Meanwhile, if you look at the numbers, countries in Eastern Europe bordering Russia received much more economic assistance proportionally, and the economic assistance that came to Russia came late, when already the population's opinion was beginning to associate the economic depression with democracy. The sort of criminal nature of and corrupt nature of many of the economic actors in early post-Soviet Russia with democracy. When they made that association, democracy was discredited. When Clinton was in power, I proposed at the time that Clinton should have done a tour of Russia, that we should have put almost all our eggs in the Russian basket, that the greatest strategic goal for the United States and for the West after the end of the Cold War was to incorporate Russia into the West. And so he should have done a tour of Russia, and in the process given out a large amount of economic assistance. There should have been no NATO expansion, and if that had been done, there might have been a different result. Unfortunately, those things weren't done. The very opposite was done, and it's a tragic thing, because we basically run Russia into the arms of China, and that's a major problem, because if you look at the future situation geostrategically, right, if you're looking at the China which is rising, obviously, and maybe it appears to be extremely ambitious, though patient, and also maybe extremely unpredictable, has its own internal threats, which could create situations where it would overreact, for example, in Hong Kong or Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang or several of them. It would have been maybe a good idea to have Russia inside Europe, inside the West, as a way to contain China. And in fact, if that were the case, there might be more leverage over India, for example, to join in such a venture. And if that is the case, then there might be, and I'm not talking about any aggression against China, I'm talking about simply making sure that we can contain whatever they may try to do as they become more ambitious and more powerful. That doesn't mean not cooperating with China, doesn't mean trying to destabilize China, but it means developing good relations with Russia and India and other countries in and around China, so that if it's necessary and China begins to act like a bull in a china shop, we have some options. Unfortunately, that wasn't done. So now we find ourselves with a China that has a Russian ally, an India that hasn't made up its mind yet where it wants to go, and that's perfectly understandable. And a Europe, a West that's divided over what to do about Russia, extremely antagonistic relations with Russia that are, basically artificially induced, not necessary. It's near catastrophic. I lost the sound. No sound.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now I can
So
hear.
if we make a statement that U.S.-Russian relationship in the 21st century was, if I look at it, was the worst during the Junior Bush era, and then it has grown better since, and it is best in time of Donald Trump. Would you agree to that? Do you think the U.S.-Russia relations have improved, or do you think it has deteriorated?
No, I think it's continuously deteriorated, beginning in the 1990s, and with there was a brief period at the beginning of each administration where there was hope. New president comes in, George Bush the younger, George Bush, then the Obama administration with the reset. But the problem is that the core problem is not removed, and that is NATO expansion, the semi-coercive or coercive expansion of democracy into Russia's neighborhood without taking into account Russia's interests, EU expansion, the abandonment of the ABM treaty, all these things just made it inevitable that Russia would turn away from democracy in the West, and NATO expansion has continued round after round after round. The only reason Ukraine and Georgia are not in NATO is because Russia resisted. First, it resisted in 2008 against Georgia in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and then it resisted with Crimea and the Donbass in Ukraine. At a certain point, the Russians said, we've had enough, because they're just simply coming too close to the border, and the same scenario is being repeated and repeated. It was just a matter of time. And so throughout in each administration, there's been more NATO expansion. There's been more financing of oppositions in countries where the regimes are more or less friendly, or at least neutral with relation to Russia. And now we see the increase in the rhetoric with the exaggerated claims of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. And I think they've never been worse, despite the fact that Trump, again, like younger Bush and like Obama, came into power trying to improve relations. And it's led to nowhere. Now, most recently, Trump has invited Putin to the G7 meeting. We'll see what happens with that.
Right. I'm making another, this is also a kind of speculative question. So if you look at in Iraq, like Putin, there are some evidences that Putin had some contact with Saddam Hussein before he was attacked. And so my question to you is, do you think that Putin could not save Saddam in 2003, but managed to save Assad in Syrian crisis?
You could look at it that way, although I think Russia had much less leverage in Iraq than it does in Syria.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, that back then they had little leverage, and now they have more leverage.
Right. In general, they've had less leverage, and also then in the more recent period during the Syrian crisis, Russia had become more powerful. Its economy had rebounded. The army had been reformed, and Russia in general had become more fed up with the Western playing around with color revolutions. And,
do you think it has anything? Do you think it has anything to do? I'm just asking a question. That it has anything to do with Russia allying up with Iran and China? We have seen those alliances even in the Security Council meetings. In the Syrian crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're beginning to sort of see this bandwagoning effect where all the non-Western powers are beginning to join up against the West because of bad policy emanating especially from Washington and, of course, from Brussels and NATO. The EU is not as responsible, but certainly Washington and Brussels with NATO are.
Yeah, thank you. I think I would now ask you very directly about your views about where the United States is going. Do you think that if the American people sort of elect another president, whether it is Biden or someone else, do you think that would lead to much lesser problems? Do you think the United States will get back some of its lost glory? So what do you think whether it's the new president, the presidential election that's coming up, or in general, the United States will go from here on?
That again is a complicated question because there's an interplay between domestic factors, which now have become completely uncertain and unstable, and the international factors. I think if Biden were to be elected, and assuming he survived several years into his presidency because he's rather old, I think relations will become much worse with Russia. With the rest of the world, probably with Europe, relations would improve because Europe is dominated by people who basically think have an ideology similar to Joe Biden's. If Trump were to be reelected, problems with Europe would continue, but it might open up some opportunities for improvement in relations with Russia because it would be his second term. He wouldn't have to worry about reelection. And depending on what's going on domestically, conceivably he could make a move. You know, we see maybe an indication of this in the fact that now that the investigation and impeachment into Trump and the impeachment of Trump have failed, and the truth is beginning to come out that Ukraine, in fact, was involved as much in the 2016 election as Russia, if not more. And Ukrainian diaspora and people in Ukraine helped organize much of what was called Russiagate. We're beginning to see that Trump is making some noises. For example, again, inviting Putin to the G7 meeting. Problem is, we also have the withdrawal from Open Skies, but he may be trying to position himself in that case with trying to reorganize, to renegotiate the New START agreement, which is about to expire. And one of his goals is to bring China into those talks. So the Open Skies withdrawal may not be something that specifically is targeting Russia. One would think that the Russians would and Putin would take the invitation to come to the G7 as a signal, as an important signal. And if it turns out that Putin goes and there's some development, then we might see an inkling of what would happen if Trump were reelected. It's interesting that this is going to actually cause greater polarization in the United States. If Putin is invited, conclusively accepts and comes, then the Democrats are just going to completely lose control of themselves. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. It's very difficult to see at this point how that would play out. But
Right. Now coming to the question of the global pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis. The United States, initially it was, people who are following the world, across the world, the COVID-19 news, they would feel that initially it was Europe which was most hit, Western Europe, also right. Iran initially. And then the entire scenario changed when the United States, the cases in the United States rapidly increased. I wouldn't ask you so much about the handling of the internal affairs of the crisis, but I would ask you that what impact do you think this would have on the United States capability? I'm talking about capability in the sense words used. How much will its capabilities would decrease when it comes to its international abilities and as a global superpower?
Well, a lot of that depends on not just the United States. Unfortunately, it depends on getting control at this stage. If it stops this summer and there's no serious second wave in the fall, then I don't think it will have any great substantial effect on the United States. However, if there's a second wave and there's an long economic recession in the United States and a long depression, and now, of course, we have the new black swan, and I don't mean that as an analogy. We have the issue of, the basically uprising of the black community over the killing of this black man in Minneapolis. And so this is adding a whole nother dimension. Generally speaking, if you're looking with this kind of domestic instability, there are two ways a leadership can go. On the one hand, they can try to rally the population by some distraction abroad, some kind of crisis abroad, sort of to produce the rallying effect. Or they can come to a realization that at this point, we better pull back a little bit from our external ambitions. Which way Trump will go? Generally speaking, I did not expect, and I do not expect Trump to be. Maybe he's learning, but I did not expect him to be competent, particularly in international relations. And I expected him to be competent in the economy, and unfortunately, COVID-19 has destroyed his good success in the economy. In international relations, he doesn't have a lot of knowledge. He doesn't have a vision. And so he's easily manipulated by people around him. He's also because he doesn't have knowledge and vision, he doesn't really know how to make the best appointments in this area. So I'm significantly concerned about the United States' foreign policy management at this point. I think it's a very risk-prone operation and prone to make mistakes. And I think we're seeing that in relations with Russia and a lot of the bluster now that's going on with China. I just don't understand it. I don't understand why, for example, Trump doesn't, or Obama hadn't called some kind of Trump actually did make a call for some kind of a summit involving all the permanent members of the National Security Council of the UN. And that seems to me would be a good idea, and something that actually would be a good idea to institutionalize to begin to solve some of these problems and these differences. Because the situation is beginning really to deteriorate rather rapidly. Another issue in terms of the United States and what directions it's go is a complete deterioration in its political culture. You know, in the United States, they don't teach the Constitution anymore. So the rule of law is beginning to weaken, and we're seeing that with the riots. We're seeing that with Obama's violation of the Constitution during his administration. A general decline in culture. We see that in Trump with the crudeness of his language and so forth and so on. So we're seeing basically a sort of decay culturally of the United States. And this is also a serious problem. It's one thing when you have a superpower that's in a decline and the international system is restructuring and there's a rising power in terms of the economy, in terms of politics. But when the former hegemon, soon to be former hegemon, declining hegemon is decaying culturally, that's also gravely worrying.
Right. And also, if you, I wanted to ask you what Trump is doing to the WHO, if you could comment on that.
You know, I'm not a big expert on that, and I'm not clear. You know, I've heard some of the reports that China had gained inordinate influence over the WHO, and this is the reason why the Chinese were able to supposedly, and again, I'm not convinced that this is true either, that China lied or delayed information. They probably did delay releasing information about what was going on in Wuhan. I'm not sure that they've falsified the figures, though that's certainly possible. But the question is, you know, is this productive, given all the other sources of tension in the relationship? Is this a good idea? And of course, again, this is being partially driven by domestic politics. This is another big problem in American politics today, is that foreign policy is being largely driven by domestic politics. Big, important foreign policy issues are being played with loosely to defeat your domestic opponents. And this creates unnecessary instability abroad because it seems to me that this is actually a much more important issue, is the international relations. International relations and the whole issue of cybersecurity and nuclear security and weapons of mass destruction, and including biological, radiological, nuclear, and so forth, are much important for the survival and prosperity of the United States than, you know, whether in fact China lied about the statistics and whether we're trying to use this for domestic purposes. What I mean using it domestic, Trump's basically trying to using this as an excuse for the high numbers in the United States. Right. Something for which he's not guilty of he's not guilty for anyway. This is the problem. And that sort of shows you a kind of weakness of character he'll use absolutely any tool to make himself look good and to make himself look as good as possible. He's very sensitive. He's got a thin skin. He can't take criticism. He's quick to lash out in response to any criticism. This is all this is completely unpresidential. You know, if you look at someone like Ronald Reagan, who was a conservative, who was considered to be a very harsh conservative, he never, ever spoke about himself, and he never used condescending language to his enemies. And even the Soviet Union besides calling the Soviet Union an evil empire once, and he only condemned communism. He never condemned Russians. He never condemned Gorbachev. He never condemned Brezhnev or Andropov. This is being presidential. Trump is not presidential. And he has an immense responsibility as the leader of the granted declining hegemon. And it's tragic. I just wrote in a recent article today that it's a tragedy that the United States stands at this moment in international affairs and domestically between chaos, between the destruction of the Constitution and between chaos, and the only thing that stands between those two things is Donald Trump. It's a tragedy.
Right. I was mainly asking about, you see, if Trump is disillusioned, for instance, and if he gets reelected, in fact, by the international organization like WHO and other organizations, and as you know, that the United States is the major funding, source for this organization. So if he freezes funding for this organization, there would be difficulties, particularly for least developed countries in Africa and in South America, etc. So do you think that would be a problem?
Well, what it may do is create more bandwagoning, right? Because other countries will probably chip in to make up for the lost financing. And in doing so, they're going to be cooperating, and they're going to be cooperating against the United States, which is precisely what we don't want to see happen.
Right.
A much better approach would have been to call for an investigation and help organize an investigation, and then conduct our own investigation and put the two investigations out there and see who in the world wants to believe which investigation.
Right.
But instead, it's the United States acting like the bull in the china shop.
True. I wanted to ask you on one last geostrategic aspect, that is the Asia Pacific area sort of thing. Do you think China and your threats with China, the United States threats with China, the United States is doing enough in the Asia Pacific region, particularly since there is also the North Korean threat existing there in the Asia Pacific region. There is also Japan and South Korea, whom you provide nuclear umbrella. So keeping all these questions in mind, and North Korean regime has been unpredictable regime so far, and I think the West do not have direct even surveillance as to what happens there on a day-to-day basis. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, this is another problem with creating problems with China, although China has a great interest in preventing the North Korea situation from blowing out of control. But nonetheless, China has always been considered the main constraint on North Korea. And so to the extent that we ruin our relations with China, the Chinese may decide at some point that they'll let the loose dog go. Rather than trying to constrain him and hold him on a leash, they may decide, well, this regime, as far as we're concerned, is a problem for us, first of all. Second of all, it can be a bigger problem for the West if we let it off the leash. And at some point, they may say, asymmetrical escalation, let this guy do what the heck he wants. And we're not going to help you anymore. And this could be a real problem. In the region, again, the most powerful country in the region besides China is India. And it seems to me that the United States should be paying a hell of a lot more attention to India rather than places like, not that they should be ignoring, Singapore and Malaysia and Australia, for example. But it seems to me that, as a democracy on the Eurasian landmass, in the Eastern Eurasian landmass, really the only serious one and a major power, that we should really be building up our relationship with India. I sort of see the potential for building a better world and creating a more democratic and stable Eurasia writ large, that is from Japan all the way to England. The two main pillars besides China are India and Russia, right? So we should be developing, if we're worried about China, rather than antagonizing Russia, we should be trying to improve our relations. Instead of antagonizing China and Russia, we should be trying to improve our relations with Russia and India. And the message will be understood in Beijing, right? But all this useless rhetoric and charges that to the average person remain unclear, whether They lied about the COVID figures and so forth. It seems to me to be absolutely useless.
You criticize President Trump a lot, but do you think that President Trump has in fact done a lot better than his predecessors in building conversation with the North Koreans, given his summits with Kim, etc.?
Yeah, that's one area where he made some progress at the beginning, and I think that was a very smart and effective move, and courageous even. The problem is there doesn't seem to be a lot of follow through. There seems to be now. This may in part be due to the instability of the domestic situation, but he seems to be easily distracted. You know, he moves from one issue to another issue. And there doesn't seem to be any consistent follow through. So, and again, the inconsistency again is underscored by the worsening of relations with China. So, in general, the idea was good. Not so sure that the implementation was all that effective.
Right. So, international politics experts have been talking about a post-COVID-19 world. So in the post-COVID-19 world, do you think that the countries that are going to play a major role, do you think, in general, there is a lot of cooperation regarding this COVID-19 crisis. So do you think there would be a world more driven by cooperation where even small states, for instance, there's a lot of, if you talk of soft power thing, there's a lot of discussion about how countries like New Zealand, for instance, have been so successful, although they are small in size, but their effectiveness when it comes to handling the crisis have brought them to the headline. So what are your comments on that? On the COVID-19 crisis and the future?
It's hard to tell because at one and the same time, it's a potential driver of cooperation in that, by definition, the world needs to cooperate to defeat this issue. On the other hand, it's also an exacerbating factor domestically in each country. It's created, especially in places like China, where it began, in the United States, where it's had the most effect. It's kind of a strange situation that at the time Chinese and the United States relations are deteriorating precipitously. This virus comes and affects those two countries the most, and for both countries, it can be a destabilizing factor. It's hard to tell. I don't see right now any great move on the edges. Yes, you see some movement towards cooperation. The problem is there are so many other issues driving the United States and China apart, driving Russia and the United States apart. All these other issues going on simultaneously, that it becomes problematic for the COVID-19 issue to push through and have a decisive effect. It seems to me, but maybe I'm wrong.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Hahn, for your very insightful discussion with us and for giving us the time and opportunity to discuss with you, which was a wonderful discussion with you. And we hope to have you again with us on different occasions. And for the viewers, this entire discussion will be available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Tillotoma Foundation, Tillotoma Foundation. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.